The Liberation of Sundrian City by Andrew Lewis. Chapter 8. Away and Anywhere. In a matter of hours, Linus managed to turn 48 gold coins into only 6 gold coins and 12 silver ones. He sat in a private courtyard at Matronarco's eatery and ate his way slowly through an enormous rump of steak. With every bite, he began to feel more and more as if he were about to vomit. But he couldn't figure out whether it was because of the sheer amount of meat he had consumed or the guilt that was blossoming in his mind. His parents were dead. Only yesterday. Evander had betrayed the family and murdered them in cold blood, and yet here Linus sat enjoying a meal unlike any he'd ever had. He looked at the stash of things he had bought that afternoon. The finest short sword he could find in the market, which had cost him 30 gold pieces. A pair of thick leather sandals with hide soles and a corked heel, and a bottle from Valento's palace reserve, which he managed to convince Valento to part with for 4 gold coins. "I'll just say that the bandit took it, if he asks," Valento had said, more to himself than to Linus. As Linus sat in the eatery, gingerly touching the razor-sharp edge of his new sword, wanting to feel its sharpness but not slice his hand, he began to feel utterly confused. It was as if he couldn't quite work out what he was supposed to do in order to honour his parents' memory. He tried hard to think what they had done when Linus Smith Sr., Linus's grandfather, had died. All he could recall was empty bottles of wine and his father weeping in a chair in the sunroom. And so he ordered the eatery servant to bring him a goblet and open his bottle of Valento's wine. An hour later, Linus was forcefully expelled from Matronarco's eatery by the very same servant. "Get a hold of yourself, son," said the servant, as Linus pulled himself up from the pavement. Linus drew his short sword and brandished it crazily around before him. But the doors of the eatery were slammed closed in his face, leaving him quite alone in the twilight of the markets. "I am Mott," he screamed. "You dare slam me out, I will trample you." No response came to his insane ramblings. 1 bottle of Valento's was surely far more than any 13-year-old boy could handle, particularly one who had never drank wine in his life. And so Linus the elephant stumbled along the roads of Sundrian City, trumpeting through his arm, drifting ever closer to his home. However, when his home came into sight, Linus was suddenly overcome with a strong urge to get as far away from it as possible. The sight of it made him cringe. The thought of opening the door and entering was sickening. He turned away from his home and sat on the cobblestone ground. He took off his old cloth sandals and cast them aside, throwing them away across the road. He unwrapped his new pair of sandals, strapped them to his feet, and stood back up. His legs were numb, but he was quite sure he had never experienced more comfortable footwear in all his years. He began walking. No longer uncoordinated, he indeed moved quite purposefully and firmly now. There was no stumble in his step. He moved in the direction of the palace, which spanned all along the end of the special residencies. He didn't know why he was walking toward the palace. He just had a strong urge to go and touch the palace walls. He began to run, as if on air, silently. He was an assassin now, a ghost, swiftly gliding across the city unnoticed, stopping only once to vomit in a potted shrubbery. No one could see him. No one could hear him. He was darkness, stealth and agility in one vessel. He followed the shadow which curved along the palace wall and ducked into its deepest, darkest crevasse. The palace walls were lined with guards, distributed evenly along its span, but not a single one had seen him. Guards! Ha! Guards were no match for Linus Smith, the Prince of Sundrian City. He drew his short sword in defiance, but then hastily holstered it again, when he noticed it was reflecting a glint of moonlight. Stealth, he reminded himself. Guards can spot the glint of a sword's blade a mile away, you fool. He doubled back along the wall, away from the palace, and took refuge in the utterly black space between a resident's home and the wall which ran along the city's edge, the arms of the mountain. He scaled up the wall, shimmying between the house and the retaining wall, which was designed to keep children and drunks from trying to climb Adalla's western arm. Once he was over the wall, he followed its dark side along for maybe a half hour, trekking slowly across ridged boulders and slipping along damp, mossy logs before finally he stopped and hoisted himself up the wall for a peek over the edge. He was looking into the palace gardens. Just a short way along was a large tree, the perfect cover for an assassin to sneak over the wall and into the palace. When he reached the tree, he climbed onto the wall and leapt from it, barely catching onto a branch with the tips of his fingers. He made his way silently down the trunk, sprinted across a span of immaculate lawn, and dived behind a nearby statue of an angel spouting water from a trumpet. He sat down on the grass, resting against the statue, and caught his breath, and as he did so, he started to wonder what it was exactly that he was doing. But alas, his drunken mind was unfocused and his thoughts were erratic. The vast gardens began to spin in his vision, and the trail of Linus's thought was thoroughly blocked by the sudden need to close his eyes and breathe heavily through his nose. There was something in close proximity emitting potent odours, sickly sweet, botanical, the likes of which Linus had never smelt before. And then he heard it. Coming faintly from somewhere nearby was the sound of a voice. It was too distant to make out the words, and it was distorted by the trickle of the angel's trumpet. But he could hear it, this much was certain. Was it a child's voice? He peered over the edge of the water fountain and scanned the gardens until he spotted its source. Across a long sheet of grass he could see the silhouettes of two figures sitting on a bench beside the glasshouse his nose had detected. One of the figures was enormous, the other petite. He also noticed a hedge that ran far enough along the edge of the garden to get him near enough to listen. He crept out of his spot and moved silently across the grass to the far side of the hedge and moved along it until he reached its end. He lay on his stomach and slid his way out, inching slowly forth for a view of the two people, only to find that once he could see them he recognised both of them instantly, and knew them by name. It wasn't a child at all, it was a girl. Right there, late at night, in the palace garden, Linus was shocked to see what he considered a most unlikely duo indeed. Goresh, the maimed abomination, and Robin, the beautiful princess, were sitting side by side on the bench. Goresh was squiggling lines in the dirt between their feet with a spindly branch, and the princess was watching intently. "And they are common?" she asked, in a hushed voice. Goresh nodded. "Well, why don't we have them?" she asked incredulously. Goresh drew some more lines in the dirt, and the princess peered down at them once more. "I just don't understand why father is so secretive about these things. It really ought to be..." The princess was cut off by a door swinging open and light spilling into the gardens. "Goresh!" bellowed the silhouette from the doorway. "I've been looking around for you. Now get inside." Goresh hastily kicked at the dirt and discreetly dropped the twig at his heels. "Good evening, Princess Robin," the man at the door added, suddenly pleasant in nature. Linus recognised the voice instantly. "Good evening, Remy," said the princess, although not half as pleasantly as Ramil had. Goresh stood and gave a bow to the princess, and as he did, Linus thought he saw him sneakily toss something small and square to her. He then wandered solemnly over to the door and went inside, Remy following close behind. The door was closed gently, and the princess was left to sit quite alone on the seat. "I know you're there," said Princess Robin. Linus froze, mortified. "Yes, you behind the hedge, I know you're there." Linus dared not to speak. He sat stock still, holding his breath, though not intentionally. He was in such shock that he couldn't bring himself to breathe if he tried. The princess stood and walked to the same door where Remy had appeared and opened it. "You'd best get out of here before you get caught. It's trial by elephant if you are," she said. And with that she crossed into the palace and closed the door behind her. A satisfying click announced that the door had indeed been locked. Linus was horror-struck, and sat still, frozen in shock for a full minute before it dawned on him that he should move, in case the princess alerted the guards. But looking back to the tree where he entered the garden, he saw the shadow of a patrolling guard wandering lazy out from behind the palace. "Can't go that way," he muttered under his breath to himself. Before the guard came within full view, Linus had up and sprinted, darting from shadow to shadow, ducking behind trees, bushes, and anything else in the garden that provided cover, until quite suddenly he was stopped in his tracks. He had rounded a corner and come quite close to running straight into an elephant, which was lying asleep on its side right there in the palace gardens, its four legs protruding stiffly to one side. Instantly he was overcome with awe. He stepped closer to the beast, no fear in his heart at all. He had forgotten about the guards. He had forgotten that he was trespassing in the Emperor's property. For that moment, he forgot about everything, even the murder of his parents. His mind was entirely clear, but for admiration of the elephant. He reached forth and touched the tip of its trunk. It stirred. It twisted its head to look at him, and suddenly it had rolled over into a kneel. Linus instinctively lowered himself to the ground and crawled back a little on all fours and then stopped. He did not wish to provoke a chase. The elephant stared at him, and Linus did everything in his power to become as unthreatening as possible, utterly submitting to the judgment of the elephant. The beast was quite small as far as war elephants go, but was also pure strength, put through rigorous training on a daily basis. This was no regular elephant. It stared silently at Linus for what felt like an eternity, until finally it dropped its gaze and flopped back onto its side, apparently more interested in sleeping than attacking. Linus closed his eyes too.